You want us to take more risk? Anything more?
That's a very tricky topic, Mohan. I'll come back to that. Mr. Singh, if you could share your thoughts on this, whether things not still changing on the ground.
Well, I think that, frankly, Mohan, you deserve a better kind of an government and a government system from the state from where you come from. And it's very easy, Mohan, to multiply and replicate examples from episodic experiences and anecdotal experience of this kind, although I'm not trying to undercut the importance of anecdotal experience. But I think clearly, as I said, there are three important things. First, I think that the government's endeavor to overcome serious problems of legacy and heresy of the past is something which we need to see in perspective. I totally agree with Shivi that these are not problems which were created today. These are problems which have been inherited for quite some time. And I think that, Mohan, when you mentioned about the high savings investment gearing ratio, clearly you should, if you look at the figures, the highest it achieved was in 2007 and 8. And Gokarn will point out that the investment savings ratio came down rather substantially, having hit 36%, 38%. It came down to now hovering around about 30, 31%. So clearly, investment savings ratio came down because of poor macroeconomic management and various other factors. And sharp contrast to which, if you look at the macroeconomic arrangements and macroeconomic parameters now, clearly we are on an upswing. Clearly, if we achieve about 7.4, which I think is a modest estimate. We move on to 8% with very modest inflation, with a current account which is very manageable, high reserves. And I agree with you, Pranjal, that the corporate sector, which really believed that the paradigm existed and paradise existed if interest rates were to really come down, which have really now come down very substantially, I think we need to address 3 or 4 very critical issues. How are we going to proceed in making India a competitive destination? There I'm totally one with you on that. How to improve total factor productivity. And this requires really a whole host of changes. Many of these changes have commenced. We need to accelerate the pace of those changes. For instance, on labor, which you mentioned very clearly, why are Indian labor costs? And we are not being able to derive the advantage of elastic supply of skilled labor. This is clearly because the conundrum of labor laws, rules and regulations have hobbled us. Labor is going, the comparative advantages are going to other countries. We have begun
here the politics is failing us.
Look, let me say that we are trying to find the maximum leeway from the kind of scenario which we inherited. To say, for instance, that the central government would accept all flexible labor laws enacted by any state government is a major step forward. Yeah. Actually, Rajasthan has done it.
Sure.
Some other, Karnataka has done it. Some other states want to go ahead. We will fully back. The central government would fully back all best examples.
That's a great idea. I'd like to bring in Subir here. Subir, the fundamental issue of demand, which seems to be a pain point, is the whole focus on reduction of interest rate going to take care of that? What will spark demand in India at a corporate and consumer level?
Okay, I think we have to look at history. Mr. Singh is talking about legacies, and I think we have to look at positive legacies. Let's go back to 2000, 2001, when the macroeconomic situation was rather weak. Inflation was low, of course, but growth was sluggish. And there wasn't much expectation of, I think at that point we were really at risk of losing the reform sort of consensus, because people are saying if you're going to not reform and grow at 5%, you're going to reform and grow at 5.1. What's the point of fighting all those political battles? But at that point, the government decided that public investment was important. The NHDP, the National Highway Development Program, was launched. And I think the very strong...
telecom was opened up.
Very strong...
And the telecom was opened
Yeah,
up.
telecom, of course, that gave its... But the way in which the National Highway Development Program took off created lots of jobs, and not jobs in cities, but jobs in rural areas where there were people. That sort of spiraled into a very, very virtuous circle, good macro, public investment momentum.
And this demand was spread across the country.
Spread across.
Yeah.
So that's when you started to see private investment also pick up, because there is direct demand being created through public investment, and those multipliers are very strong. You have more roads, you're going to get more autos, and so on and so on. Now, I think that's the model, not necessarily in terms of roads alone, but on a broader spectrum of infrastructure. That's the model we need to do. That's why I think the public investment in infrastructure is going to be the trigger for everything else.
So this time around, Subir, what the government has planned in terms of the industrial corridors, which are happening across the geographic locations, and because the Delhi-Mumbai industrial corridor was seen as a successful model, is that then one of the triggers to spark demand?
I think yes, in concept, because it is bringing infrastructure is a network. You know, you can't have a road and nothing else. And we have this problem if you try to get onto a national highway, whether it's Mumbai-Pune expressway or anything else, it takes you hours and hours to get to the highway, then you spend half an hour on the highway, and then you're again taking hours and hours to get off. In the Agra expressway, to me, for example, you spend as little time as possible on the highway because you're moving at 90 kilometers an hour, but it takes you 2 hours to get there and 2 hours to get off.
It's easier to take a flight to the highway.
The network concept of infrastructure is very critical. I have a friend who set up a port, state-of-the-art, modern equipment, everything. I asked him, how's it doing? 20% capacity utilization. Why? Because there's no road link. The Department of Surface Transport did not deliver. There's no rail link because the railways did not deliver. So you got all that equipment, that investment, that money locked up, but you can't use it. So infrastructure is fundamentally a network. Power, coal, transmission, roads, everything is interlinked. So corridors provide that solution. They give you a holistic set of inputs in a concentrated space. I think they're very important. But we can't take 15, 20 years building corridors. You know, the thing about highways, the advantage was it really moved very fast. You know, the pace of highway construction between 2001 and 2003 was phenomenal. And you could see this, you know, every day you were seeing tangible, if you're not maintaining that kind of pace, we're really losing out. So I think we've got to balance out the network benefits with the speed. And somewhere there is a middle ground, I think, which we need to find.
So that's a good point, because Mohan also referred to the efficiency part of it. Shivinder, the thought of having great ideas, but failing at the altar of execution, that has been something that India has always been very good at. What kind of steps would you suggest which will ensure that the big ideas actually get implemented on ground? What role can the industry play here?
Well, I think what a lot of the companies, and especially senior executives, started doing, and we should do in a lot larger numbers, is pretty critical. I think there's a certain movement that started off in India in the last couple of years where it's not just private equity or VC money, but it's actually senior executives and companies that are actually starting to mentor and guide new startups. As much as the innovation and the bubble is sitting at the bottom of the pyramid in terms of the age group, there's a lot of wisdom sitting at the top where people have actually gone through these challenges and know your idea may be great, but you can't register a company or things of that nature. Or if you need this, you need a license, and the fastest, best way to do that is in this manner, and so on and so forth. So I think a lot of an ecosystem within the industry of actually helping new startups rather than looking at them as either adversaries or kids on the block or something like that is something that India should do, because we have huge management talent, we have very good industries, but I think a lot of companies are insular in the way they look at themselves. They don't actually look outside their businesses. So to encourage senior executives sitting here, board members, to actually go and mentor and guide new startups is something that I'm actually seeing happening, but I think it should happen in much larger measures. Maybe Bangalore, Delhi, Bombay are markets which is more natural for that to happen. And senior executives in the company also should look at the fact that this is part of duty to go back to society in some ways. It's not just, it's not taking out my time from my job and doing, helping a kid or whatever the case is. I think that is one that's required. I think second is also industries, companies and executives actually investing in these companies. Because that's the only way you can incubate talent to actually grow. So if you've got a young guy who's looking at setting up an entrepreneurial setup in his, instead of discouraging from getting out of your company because you'll lose talent, you got to invest in the guy, either personally or through the organization, depending on the sector. And then you start creating an ecosystem for the country per se. So I think some of those things are ideas that I would believe that would help in something like that.
Yeah, Mr. Singh, great ideas, and you see that resonating across. Nobody doubts the quality of campaigns that the Prime Minister has unleashed. But at the regional level, at the place, as you would say, where the rubber hits the ground, apart from changing the government in Karnataka, what are the ways in which you can ensure that these percolate where, you understand governance so well, you understand how the mid and the lower bureaucracy works, and these are the biggest stumbling blocks to any change that you can conceive of? You led a lot of reforms when you were in the finance ministry, but in true honesty, how much of that actually made a difference on the ground? So what kind of effort is required to remove this web at the ground level? Mike, please.
Well, I think that, that's a very broad question, but I would say three important.
It's a very specific question, Mr. Singh.
But,
lower I'll rephrase it. What can we do to ensure that the bureaucrats and the officials at the state and block level help enterprises?
Very good. So I think that the first thing which they need to do is you need to alter the culture of reward and penalty within the bureaucracy. Right now, today, in the culture in the bureaucracy, there is every premium on indecision and every premium on status quo, and very little recognition of rewarding meritocracy. So this is one. Second, I think that the unhealthy practice of not protecting bureaucracy in terms of the bona fide decisions which they have taken is a terribly debilitating factor when it comes to incentivizing bureaucracy. You know of instances where secretaries who have retired, 7 years after they have retired, suddenly some cases are really opened against them. This really can hardly incentivize a new generation of bureaucracy which believes and which sees for himself the kind. So I think that altering the system of reward and penalty within bureaucracy, firewalling the bureaucracy in terms of excessive political interference is something on which several administrative reforms commissions have made recommendations, some way in which that can be really pushed forward. And third, and importantly, I think the idea of a competitive federalism needs to be given more tangible shape. How to really make states a more attractive destination, which will incentivize investments, which will improve life quality, which will alter the electoral psyche in a manner where there is the ability of the same government getting re-elected. So I would say three very important factors in terms of bureaucracy. One, in terms of a different structure of reward and penalty. Second, bringing in factors of competitive federalism. And third, a protection of bona fide decision-making within the bureaucracy. And fourth, which has begun to happen, a much greater interaction between the bureaucracy and the senior echelons of political decision-making. I cannot remember, Pranjal, of any recent instance where the Prime Minister himself has found so much time for interaction with middle-level bureaucracy in different ministries and monitoring the implementation of projects and processes. I think that's something which I think the bureaucracy values in access to be able to communicate his views to the higher echelons of bureaucracy. So I think a lot of action has begun, and I think if a couple of these things which I have mentioned, in addition to few other things, if you give me just 1 minute, sure, Pranjal, I really think that some of the things which has bedeviled India's competitive factor advantages are exactly those things on which some hands are being laid on. One is, for too long and too tardily have we approached this whole issue of litigation, enforcement of contract, and alternative ways in which judicial reforms have been stalled for far too long. The role of the courts need to be redefined in a manner which enables really a greater synergy while protecting bona fide of decision-making at a faster pace. That's something which I think enforcement of contract, alternative ways of settling disputes and finding. Second, in the manner in which you look upon taxation, and to make India, not only to make India an attractive investment destination, we also need to make India an attractive tax destination. I think that the excessive amount of tax adventurism of the past, a lot of which is now being addressed, is something which I hope will be able to augur stability and confidence in the transparency of the tax regime as we begin to attract more investments globally and we begin to protect really investments in this country. I think that these two, in my view, are central to improving the ease of doing business in this country and central to getting more investment off the ground.
Thank you, Mr. Singh. Shivinder, you wanted to respond?
No, I just wanted to add with the rewards comment of the bureaucracy that you also have to get accountability down there, because you can do all the rest of it, but I think there's a lot of lack of accountability today. You can get away, like he said, status quo. And there's a very big role of technology in that to actually get some of that happening. I'll just share you a quick example just to explain the point. We had applied for one license for one of the hospitals. And it was lying there for months and months on end till one of our senior guys actually went and met the bureaucrat that I was sitting with. So he turned around in his very chaste native language and he turned around and says to our guy to say, "You finally come. I was looking at seeing how do you think you could have got away with getting a license without coming and kind of, doing whatever he had to do, bowing his head or whatever the case is." He says, "I was also seeing that, what do you think you become so big that you can get a license without even coming to my office?" And I mean, we have to get 45 licenses to get a hospital going. You're not supposed to be going and doing matha takeoing to every single bureaucrat in the establishment, and you really can't get through the whole rigmarole of it. So I think accountability and technology's role there is huge to get all the rest of the stuff that he's talking about, which I completely agree with Mr. Singh. I think a lot of them is very critical and now time-bound to get some of that going.
So that's fine. I think that's an interesting point. Whenever you want to seek divine intervention, you should know exactly which officer to seek divine intervention from. Mohan, please.
Yeah, Pranjal, let me explain the frustration and anger. There is a gap between potential and reality. And the gap has not come down in the last maybe 10 years. The Prime Minister is doing very much to reduce the gap, so we work at full potential. We could grow at 9.9 to 10% a year. All of us are willing. We know what to do, okay? But China has grown 9.9% a year from 1978 till 2014. We have grown at 6.9% a year from 1991 till 2014. So if you can, in last decade we grew at 7.9%. If you can grow at 9 to 10%, we need to be empowered. It's not that industry is not doing enough. We need to be empowered. Our energies need to be released. We are very positive. We are gung-ho. We can do many things. And in many industries, we have done that. So let's not blame industry. We must find out how to release the animal spirit, how to reduce the roadblocks that come in our way, and make sure people go and invest. And let me give you another piece of data. Bank lending to GDP is only 60%. We have an anemic banking system. Such as underdeveloped anemic banking system. China's bank to GDP is 2.4 times GDP. We are 0.6 times GDP. Maybe China is in excess. We still need to have a financial system which is robust to give you capital. There are many things to be done. So, whatever we say...
You're giving me the perfect question to put to Subir
Whatever
now.
we say here, don't think is negative.
Right.
It's just that we want to work here, we are here, but we want to be here. And please close the gap. And the gap can be closed by you. Please release us, make us free, and watch the wonders.
So what would be the... Thank you, Mohan. So Subir, what would be the iron pill for the anemic banking sector?
Well, one reason and the major reason why it is in a state of dysfunction now is that banks lend to infrastructure projects at the height of optimism about PPP in 2006-07. And all of those assets, or most of those assets, have turned sick. So the banks are sitting on an NPA load, which is structural, which is not cyclical. Normally, NPAs are cyclical in the sense that when the economy goes into a slowdown, NPAs increase, but then there's a recovery, which reduces NPAs. This is structural. It doesn't matter how fast you're growing. If you're not tackling the infrastructure problem, you're not going to get these assets off the bank's books. So I think we have to be thinking in terms of a bad bank, whatever you want to call it. Not a bad bank, a good bank, an infrastructure bank, whatever it is. But unless we repair bank balance sheets in some credible fashion and quickly, you cannot get new money into banks because nobody sees these as worthwhile assets. And if you do get new money, it's a leaky bucket.
So would you say that's one of the biggest challenges for this government today?
Absolutely. I mean, the Indra Dhanush is a sort of a recognition of those problems and an attempt to address it across a variety of fronts. But the scale of the problem in terms of being able to take these assets off the books, I think, is important. You can't do it all at once, no question. So you have to be selective, you have to prioritize, you have to do what is called triage, which is, look at the banks which have the assets that are closest to being able to reach completion, pick them off and sort of, go sequentially. But unless we recognize that banks, firstly, should not have been financing infrastructure, but at that point you had no alternative. They cannot manage the asset liability balance between their funding strategy or funding formula and infrastructure lending. We've got to take them off the bank books. Now, 60%, 2.4 is, China may be excessive, but regardless of the number, the fact right now is that banks are not, because of the asset quality burden, are not able to finance their traditional constituencies. SMEs, short-term working capital loans,
Right.
short gestation capex. All of these are what banks do as bread and butter business. They're not able to do this, which is why your credit growth is so slow.
And all
every rupee of deposit that the banks are mobilizing is actually going to government securities.
And
so
the
the
great
banks have become
stories,
banks to government,
yeah.
not to the private sector, and that's the fundamental problem here.
And the big exciting stories we hear of FDI and PE and private equity is really about equity, nothing about fundamentals of debt and borrowing, right?
No, all of those are great things to happen, but what keeps business running is bank credit.
Right.
And if bank credit is growing at 9% when your economy is growing at 7%, that suggests that a lot of your business community is simply not getting access to finance, and it could throttle the recovery. I think that's something we've got to recognize.
So pure equity alone won't help, right, Mohan?
No, but this equity is going to startup. There are 18,000 startups in India with $75 billion of value and 300,000 people employed. And every year we get $8 to $10 billion and 5,000 startups and maybe 125, 150,000 people employed. So we're seeing green springs, green shoots come up in a particular area, but it's not widespread. We have to focus on real economy. The digital economy is starting to do well, but the real economy is where the problem is, and that's like he says, we need working capital, we need ease of doing business, we want demand generation, we want those assets to be released, they have to be productive, etc. I'll give you another piece of data. 300,000 megawatts of power is available in this country, 300,000 megawatts. Only 150,000 megawatts is actually producing power. So what happened to the balance 150,000 megawatts? NTPC's PLF has come down from 84% to maybe 65% today. So we have excess capacity. We have to use this capacity, lower the cost. Because of low capacity usage, costs are shot up, and that is making things viable. So we got to make the economy competitive by lowering costs, increasing efficiency, and that's what I meant.
But I think that, as Subir has raised some important issues, that the banking reforms must be, and fundamental banking reforms, which really means one of the big things is giving greater autonomy to banks. And I think that a very credible step would be if the government equity in the bank is substantially really brought down, which is what the finance minister has really hinted yesterday in Bombay, of bringing the equity to 51%, of altering the composition of the board of the banks in terms of much better quality of people with domain knowledge being able to put in important managerial positions, all part of in the Tanush. But idea is to get it implemented as quickly as possible. Some may require legislative changes, which may take time. But banking reforms, bankruptcy laws being put in, exits being made much easier, these are central not only to improving the ease of business, but these would be central to improving the overall competitiveness of the economy. And I agree with you entirely, Subir, that the balance sheet of the banks, which have been locked up, in 2 or 3 large areas, particularly in infrastructure, need to be really addressed in a more substantial and a more fundamental way to ease up the room for getting lending off the ground. I think, I think on the power sector, look, the electricity boards are bankrupt. So how are the solvency of the electricity boards going to be addressed? You have a regulatory capture in most states, with the result that the regulators are not being able to allow to function with independence. So again, the issue is one in the case of banks of autonomy, in the case of the electricity sector, freeing up the regulators from excessive control by people who have appointed the regulators and getting off a regulatory capture, which has harmed the electricity sector so terribly.
I've already got, so we have a few minutes left, about 10, 15 minutes left for the session, and I have a pile of questions here. And if we were to address this, we need another 3-day convention of AIMA. So I'm going to try to, distill some of these thoughts. And one of the thoughts which is emerging is that there is too much effort which the big industry leaders, the government leaders are focusing on the big macro picture, the fantastic great campaigns. But the mid-level industry crisis that there is of energizing small and medium enterprises, some of the issues of startup that you mentioned, not enough is being done on those issues. So why isn't there a campaign by the government at the national and the state level to energize enterprise at the ground level? And I would probably request all 4 of you to respond to this, because this is at the core of growth. Subir, perhaps with you.
There's a legal principle that the punishment should fit the crime. And I think that can be translated into a regulatory principle also, that the regulatory burden should fit the size of the operation. Now, I'm part of a startup, 5 people, 6 people, 8 people. It's a non-profit, but the compliance load as a result of the Companies Act is phenomenal. I seem to be spending more time, complying with companies' law requirements than I'm spending what I'm supposed to be doing. And this gets back to Mohan's point about when an entrepreneur sets up a company, he wants to spend as much time as possible, leveraging off his knowledge in developing the product or the process or whatever he wants to take to market. But if it's spent in compliance, you really end up destroying the business model. The wrong resources are being assigned to the wrong objectives. And I think that's really the core of the problem. We have sort of somewhat of a one-size-fits-all regulatory framework from which the burden falls disproportionately on smaller enterprises, smaller businesses. And I think that's something we have to address. You cannot have a regulatory framework which does not distinguish and differentiate in terms of resource requirements between different sized companies. If you don't address that, I think we're really not going to break out of this huge comparative disadvantage that smaller businesses they have to deal with lots of others.
Yeah, so
This
the issue is
an
also
added
of going beyond the central government, and perhaps Mohan, the specific point which you could respond to is that should we stop looking at the prime ministers and just focus on the regional chief ministers and leaders, because that's where the action and the change can happen and must happen.
I totally agree with you. You must look at city government and the state government because that's where the action is. But let me tell you another issue. We have political leaders who are out of sync with the needs of the economy. They're catering to a different constituency, whereas they have to look at people who can grow the economy and do that. We got to solve that challenge too, where chief minister focus on giving more and more subsidies rather than putting money. Take Bangalore for example. We pay 65% of Karnataka's taxes. We get only 16% back. We spend 2 to 3 hours a day sitting on the roads, going nowhere. For the last many years, no investment in Bangalore. Huge amounts of jobs. It's the richest city in India, the per capita income of $8,500. But we see no hope.
And the same story for Delhi and Mumbai and Chennai as well.
Our cities are broken. If you improve city governance, GDP will go up 1 or 2% a year.
Why doesn't the industry put pressure on the chief minister? Why is it only about the prime minister? And I'll come to Mr. Singh.
It's because we
Shivinder
meet them, they say yes, but do nothing because they don't know what to do, and the bureaucracy doesn't respond. They're in the comfort zone. They got the bungalows, they got the houses, they got the pensions, and salaries are gone up. Who cares? There is no punishment. I'll tell you one thing. Can you get 5-6 people and hang them in public for not doing the job? The message will go. Prime Minister is doing that. The Chief Minister should do that. We get hung. We get hung. If you're listed, if you don't perform, your stock tanks, man. You're sacked. But there's nothing for them. So look,
I think
like Mr. Singh said, we have to make sure people perform for the job for whatever it's worth.
I think one thing everybody will agree for, that perhaps Mohan should stand for elections. Mohan, you have to. I'm sure all of us, at least in this hall, you will have our vote.
I'll be a failure like Nandan.
That was very well said. Mr. Singh? Why is this grand plan focus not, why can't we get out of it? It's not just this government, all previous governments, we love to make these grand announcements, big policy plans. Nothing changes on the ground, and all the questions and piles that I have is really about mindset of change, where companies, individuals, ideas want to go ahead, but they are held back.
Look, when it comes to small and medium industries, I totally agree with Subir that the regulatory and compliance hurdle is absurd. I mean, you cannot have a worse company law than what was enacted in 2013. How can you have a company law where rules for something like 180 more rules have yet to be framed? It is one of the most ponderous laws and pays scant attention to the needs of small and medium industries. Credit. It's impossible for small and medium industries to access credit in a manner which would enable him to focus on his business than being able to secure some degree of credit. So I think issues of credit and market. And finally, I want to ask myself this question for which I have no answer. But we created as a ministry of small and medium industries. Why has a whole ministry of small and medium industries failed to bring about the basic succor and relief and encouragement which small and medium industries need to be receiving? And this was not created now.
A lot of people say, Mr. Singh, that if you remove and close down the ministry, things will improve.
Well, if you did that, I think that would be a very good suggestion to make to the political leadership that we're closing. I mean, that was said about the telecom, that I remember that the Silicon Valley entrepreneurs once told me at Stanford that one of the reasons why the telecom has really, that has flourished, is you didn't have a ministry regulating the growth of software engineers and the telecom sector. Now, if that is the example to be followed, that's something which is a suggestion which could emanate from this conference as a recommendation.
Are you going to be suggesting that, sir?
How to restructure the ministry in a more meaningful manner to address issues of compliance, address issues of access to credit, address issues of marketing, because I entirely agree that that's where the great employment will come for in this country.